live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about the episode The Return of the Archons. So I've already claimed in this series that we've had a couple of overtly anti-capitalist, or at least critical of capitalism videos, or episodes in the original series of Star Trek. Return of the Archons is the first overtly anti-Soviet episode. In The Return of the Archons, the Enterprise crew goes to investigate the loss of a previous starship, the Archon, 50 years earlier on this particular planet. What they find when they get there is an extremely well-ordered society in which everyone is peaceful, everyone is happy, everyone is perfectly content, but they have no individuality, no creativity, there's no struggle for improvement. It is basically a mechanized society run by an enigmatic figure called Landru. The Enterprise crew, in attempting to figure out what's going on, sort of joins forces with this smallish underground resistance to Landru, and they basically end up toppling this society. Kirk and Spock figure out that Landru is a computer, which is later confirmed when they break into the Hall of Audiences, where the priests and the lawgivers and whatnot go to consult with Landru. And basically this is the first instance in the original series of a trope that we get multiple times, where Kirk logics a computer to death. Not especially sound logic in this case, but Kirk logics the computer into destroying itself, thereby setting this society free. At which point the Enterprise is just like, well, our job is done. So they leave a sociologist and... Sorry, my cat's screaming. I don't know if that's going to show up in the recording. So the Enterprise leaves a sociologist and a crew of experts in like agriculture and whatnot to basically rebuild civilization on this planet, because this is a society where for 6,000 years their lives, on the level of their minds, have been run by this computer, and suddenly this computer has been destroyed. So, how is this an anti-Soviet storyline? Well, I think it's fairly straightforward in that Landru promises security, prosperity, happiness, etc., in exchange for absolute obedience and authority within the body. So, the Soviet Union, especially prior to the 70s, I think really during the late 50s and the 60s, you started to have a major shift. But before that, there was a lot of people in the West who bought into Soviet propaganda of the Soviet Union being a workers' paradise of prosperity, egalitarianism, contented workers, and peasants, etc., etc. By the 60s, and especially by the 70s, that image was basically destroyed as the excesses of Stalinism became increasingly well known. But that was part of the propaganda, part of the ideology of the Soviet Union, was that everyone who was a proper communist was part of this unified, happy, prosperous, contented body, and that anyone who was not part of that body of the communist collective, that they were a threat. So, in this case, I mean, and this is not just the Soviet Union, this is totalitarianism as such, but the Soviet Union did this really, really effectively. And of course, the Soviet Union was the big antagonist of the US during the Cold War. The Soviet Union, in the Star Trek universe, will later come to be the Klingons, whereas the Federation represents the US, Western Europe, NATO, whatever it is. So we've got that stuff that really develops later on. But the idea that in exchange for conformity and submission to a unified collective, you get peace, prosperity, happiness, etc., etc., is kind of the Soviet communist idea, in a way. Like, it's not necessarily right, but that's particularly in Western understandings of the Soviet Union, that's often how it's understood. And Kirk, Spock, and the others essentially come along and say, well, happiness is not the thing that matters. Being part of the group is not the thing that matters. What matters is individuality and freedom and creativity. And so this is ultimately the argument that Kirk makes against the computer. Because Landru, the computer, or Landru's computer, I suppose more accurately, because Landru programmed the computer 6,000 years ago, and the computer has just been running things ever since, theoretically with the wisdom and objectives that Landru programmed into it. Anyway, not that important, the distinction. So Kirk makes the argument, ultimately, that because the computer's primary objective is the health of the body, the good of the body, that stifling individuality, stifling creativity, and stifling freedom is actually killing the body. Therefore, the computer, by doing those things, is undermining its primary objective. And whatever threatens that primary objective must be destroyed, therefore the computer must destroy itself. This is Kirk's line of reasoning. Now, a couple of things that are really interesting about this. One is that Kirk asks the computer what the health of the body means. And the computer's answer does not include the idea of creativity, freedom, or individuality. The computer's answer of what constitutes the good is things like harmony, prosperity, unity, survival, all of which it has achieved. Arguably, it has achieved those things better than a society in which individuals are free to pursue their own objectives. So by the standards that the computer itself established for what constitutes the good of the body, it should not fall prey to Kirk's logical argument, because Kirk sets a different group of standards. Kirk says creativity, freedom, individuality are what the body needs. These are the good of the body. It's not clear why the computer accepts that argument. So logically, there's a bit of a problem with Kirk's approach to arguing the computer to death. But for the sake of the episode, we'll accept it. The other thing here that's really, really worth noting, though, is that Kirk just takes it upon himself to destroy the entire foundation of this civilization. Now, this is actually the first instance. This is actually the first instance, I think, in which the Prime Directive is mentioned, but it's not developed here. It's just sort of mentioned in passing. Spock says, "What about the non-interference directive?" And Kirk says that only applies to living, growing civilizations. We, of course, have already seen the Enterprise crew interfere in living, growing civilizations with no real qualms about doing so. But it's not necessarily clear that Kirk has the authority to unilaterally make that decision. And it's worth further noting that there is no attempt whatsoever by the Enterprise crew to assess whether or not the people of this planet want Landru destroyed. I mean, admittedly, most of them are under the control of Landru, but it's not super clear that they would prefer not to be under the control of Landru. I mean, this is the thing. Kirk decides on behalf of this planet that it is better to have freedom, individuality, creativity than it is to have absolute peace, tranquility, and prosperity. And while from an American individualist perspective that seems like a fair trade, it's not necessarily clear that Kirk should be able to get to make that decision for other people, for another planet. But this is also really significant in terms of how the U.S. approaches global politics. Because there are quite a number of instances in which the U.S., frequently through the U.S. military or through covert activity by the CIA, has said, without consulting the people of this country, we are going to topple the government of this country because we believe that they don't meet whatever criterion, that they don't allow enough freedom, or that they are oppressive, or something like this. And so we are going to destroy this government and impose our own government style on you. Iraq and Afghanistan are particularly good examples of this. I mean, yes, Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator. Do we have any real substantive evidence that a majority of people in Iraq would prefer the U.S. to have invaded and destabilized their nation for over a decade? I mean, it was not a democratic decision by the people of Iraq to invite the U.S. to invade and topple Saddam Hussein. The U.S. decided from outside that this was the ethical thing to do, regardless of what the people of Iraq might want. So, again, this is in Return of the Archons, this is meant to be a good thing. We are meant to see Kirk as liberating this planet. But it's certainly not a democratic move, and it's not clearly and objectively in the best interests of the people on the planet. Kirk decides it is, but we don't know that they believe that. And in fact, as the episode is ending, the little denouement at the end, the final little bit, the sociologist that the Enterprise has left calls in and says, "Hey, everything's going great. We've had a bunch of domestic violence and bar brawls." That's somehow the standard of a great and successful society. Like, this was a society in which, yes, there was violence, because there's this weird thing called festival that's never really explained. That's actually, I think, a carnivalesque element, right? Like, Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian theorist, came up with this idea of the carnivalesque, wherein in a repressive society, you periodically let people give vent to violence, to sexuality, to mockery of the authorities, etc., etc. And then that allows the peasants or the workers or whatever it is to go about their daily lives and be controlled within this hierarchical society. So that, I think, is what festival is, but it's never really explained in the episode. Basically, it's just like a 12-hour or so period of catastrophic violence. But it's also very organized. It is limited in scope. It serves, probably, if it is the carnivalesque, it serves a social function. What the Enterprise and what Kirk's actions replace that with is the continuing social potential for violence. And somehow that's seen as a standard for success.